There is an experience in the spiritual life that many people go through, but almost no one knows how to explain without feeling guilty. It's that phase where you pray and feel nothing. The words come out, you try to focus, you try to do it the right way, but inside it feels empty. There is no comfort, no unusual peace, none of that sense of closeness to God that you once had. And that's frightening, because you remember how it used to be. You remember moments when praying felt easier, lighter, even emotional. You remember sensing God's presence in a clear, almost tangible way. You remember finishing prayer with a warm heart, renewed hope, and the certainty that He was there, listening, acting, caring. Now, instead of that, there is silence. You keep praying, keep going to church, keep trying to keep your faith alive. But inside, a painful comparison begins to grow. I used to feel more. And that sentence starts to echo like a silent accusation, as if the lack of feeling were proof that something broke. As if the change in your experience meant that God stepped away. Then comes the question that hurts deep down. Did He pull away from me? You try not to think about it, but the thought returns, especially on the hardest days, when you most need direction, comfort, or an answer. You seek God, talk to Him about your struggles, your fears, your pain. And all you seem to find is the impression that you're talking to yourself. The pain isn't only from the problem you're facing. It's the pain of continuing to seek and not perceiving a response. It's the effort to maintain faith while your heart feels like it's lagging behind. It's kneeling to pray and getting up with the feeling that nothing changed, outside or inside. And in the middle of all this, a quiet fear is born. Did I do something that pushed God away? You start reviewing your life, your attitudes, your failures. You think about past sins, recent mistakes, things you could have done better. Your mind searches for an explanation, because the idea of a distant God hurts too much. So you reach a conclusion without even noticing. If He's far, it must be my fault. That thought is heavy, because now, on top of the normal suffering of life, you carry the feeling of having been left behind by God. As if you've been spiritually abandoned. As if you crossed some invisible line that made Him withdraw in silence. But what if this feeling is not abandonment, but a different kind of presence? The Bible is far more honest about the human experience with God than much preaching tends to be. It does not hide discomfort, soften the pain, or pretend that faith eliminates the feeling of abandonment. On the contrary, it records in detail deeply faithful people walking through exactly this kind of spiritual darkness that many today assume is a sign of failure. David is one of the clearest examples. Known as a man after God's own heart, he did not live in constant spiritual euphoria. In several Psalms, David expresses raw, unfiltered anguish. He asks, "Why have you forsaken me?" This is not a theological question. It is the cry of someone who prays and does not feel an answer. Someone who knows God, yet does not perceive Him as near in that moment. David says this not after abandoning faith, but in the middle of it, while still seeking, still praying, still walking. Job goes through something even more extreme. He loses almost everything: family, health, stability, social dignity. In the height of his pain, Job speaks to God, questions, laments, tries to understand. But for a long time, he receives no explanation. Heaven seems closed. There is no immediate comfort, no clear answers, no quick relief. Job keeps addressing God even when there seems to be no reply. His faith is not sustained by a felt presence, but by a deep decision to keep speaking to God in the silence. The prophets knew this experience well too. Over and over they ask, "How long, Lord? How long will injustice continue? How long will evil seem to win? How long will God remain silent?" These questions do not come from unbelief, but from relationship. It is precisely because they expect something from God that the silence hurts so much. The questioning is born from closeness, not distance. And then there is Jesus. On the cross, He speaks one of the most disturbing sentences in all of Scripture. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus does not only feel physical pain, He expresses a real sense of abandonment. The Son of God experiences, at the limit, what many try to hide, the impression that the Father is distant. This does not mean God truly abandoned Him. It means that, in that moment, the human experience of Jesus includes that deep darkness. This completely changes how we see this phase of faith. Because if David felt it, if Job endured it, if the prophets asked it, if Jesus Himself expressed it, then then feeling abandoned by God is not automatically proof that something went wrong. It is not evidence that you lost your faith. It is not confirmation that God walked away from you. The Bible does not hide these moments because they are part of real faith, a faith that does not live only on quick answers, but also walks through silence. A faith not sustained only by feelings, but by deep trust. Feeling abandoned by God is not the end of faith. Sometimes it is exactly the point where faith stops being superficial and starts becoming real. There is a very common mistake in the spiritual journey that often goes unnoticed, confusing the absence of feeling with the absence of God, as if His presence could be measured by what your heart feels in a given moment. When there is emotion, comfort, and immediate warmth, the conclusion is, God is close. But when those sensations fade or disappear, the automatic interpretation is, He moved away. This kind of faith is deeply emotional, not false but immature. At the beginning of the journey, it is common for experiences with God to come with strong feelings. Prayer moves you, worship stirs you, Scripture seems to speak directly to your heart. These experiences are real and important. The problem begins when, without realizing it, a person starts depending on them as constant proof that God is present. Then a different phase arrives. Emotion no longer comes as easily. Prayer feels quieter. Worship no longer brings the same tears. Reading the Bible requires more discipline than impulse. And in that setting, the rushed conclusion seems almost inevitable. Something is wrong with me, or God moved away from me. But no relationship is sustained by feeling alone. Think of any deep bond in real life. There are seasons of intensity and seasons of stability. Moments of long conversations and moments of comfortable silence. The other person's presence does not stop being real just because emotion is not constant. In fact, the maturity of the relationship shows when it remains strong even without constant stimulation. It is no different with God. Spiritual maturity begins precisely when perception fails, when you can no longer feel clearly, yet choose to keep believing. When emotional signals decrease, but the decision to remain increases. At this point, faith stops being sustained by experiences and starts being sustained by conviction. God is not limited to what you feel. Your senses are limited, unstable, influenced by fatigue, stress, routine, and disappointment. If God's presence depended on your emotional state, it would be as unstable as your mood. But His nature does not fluctuate with your perception. He remains who He is, remains present, remains at work, even when you perceive nothing. Silence does not mean distance. Often, silence marks a transition of seasons. Before, God was perceived in a more sensitive, almost instructional way. Now He begins to reveal Himself in a deeper, less obvious way, less dependent on emotional stimuli. This is not abandonment, it is growth. Like a teacher who, after explaining the basics, stops repeating everything constantly so the student can develop firmness of their own. Maybe God hasn't left. Maybe He has simply stopped being obvious. There is a stage in the spiritual journey that is almost always misunderstood. It is when a person looks at their life and thinks, God stepped away. Prayers seem to hit the ceiling, the presence once easily felt no longer seems the same, and the heart concludes that something was lost. But often, this is not a stage of abandonment. It is a stage of construction. While you think God has gone, He may be working at a level that no longer depends on visible signs. At the beginning of faith, God often uses clearer confirmations, quicker answers, and striking experiences. This helps form basic trust, like someone learning to walk who still needs constant support. But if faith keeps depending only on these stimuli, it never matures. So the transition begins. God starts forming a faith that does not depend on feeling something all the time, a faith that continues even without goosebumps, tears, or intense moments. This is uncomfortable, because it removes the emotional supports that once served as proof that everything was fine. Yet this is exactly how faith grows deeper roots. In this phase, two things are strongly built: perseverance and trust. Perseverance is the ability to continue even without emotional motivation. It is praying again, believing again, remaining again, even after silent days. This is not formed in times of spiritual euphoria, but in seasons of apparent monotony and silence. Trust, in turn, stops being based on what God does quickly and becomes based on who He is constantly. This is the transition from childish faith to mature faith. Childish faith needs frequent rewards to remain steady. Mature faith learns to remain even without emotional confirmation. It understands that God is still good, wise, and present, even when the senses cannot perceive that clearly. It is not a colder faith, it is a more stable one. Silence, then, stops being only a source of anguish and also becomes a tool for growth. It reveals motivations, purifies expectations, and strengthens the decision to stay with God for who He is, not only for what He provides. The relationship moves from the logic of immediate reward to the logic of faithful permanence. If this message is putting into words exactly the season you're living through and helping you understand what feels confusing inside, subscribe to the channel. Here we talk about real faith, the kind that keeps existing even without applause, intense emotions, or quick answers. Because the season when God seems most distant may be the very one in which He is working most deeply within you. There is a truth that, once understood, completely changes how you interpret this dark spiritual season. God does not abandon His own. What He often withdraws is not His presence, but the feeling of His presence. And that makes all the difference. When the feeling decreases, the heart's first conclusion is, "I've been left." But the opposite may be happening. God is not pulling away, He is deepening. He is strengthening the root of your faith so that it no longer depends only on emotional experiences, but stands on something more solid than feelings, His character. At the beginning of the journey, feeling is important. Emotions help you perceive God's care, closeness, and comfort. But if faith remains based only on that, it becomes fragile. Feelings fluctuate. Good days come, hard days too. If God's presence is measured only by what you feel, your faith will rise and fall like an emotional roller coaster. So at certain moments, God allows perception to fail, so that trust can grow. You are not being rejected. You are being matured. Like a father who, at a certain point, lets go of the bicycle so his child can learn to ride, God sometimes removes the constant sense of support not to abandon you, but to strengthen you. The absence of feeling does not mean absence of care. It means training in stability. Walking with God includes seasons of intense light, but also seasons of darkness. Darkness is not proof that the journey ended. Often, it is the stretch where sight stops being the main guide and trust takes control. It is where you keep walking not because you see clearly, but because you have learned who you are trusting. At this point, faith stops being merely a reaction to what you feel and becomes a decision based on what you know about God. You remember His faithfulness in the past. You remember His character revealed in Scripture. You remember that He does not change, even when your emotions do. And leaning on that, you continue. True faith is born right here, when continuing makes no emotional or logical sense, yet you remain. Not because it is easy, not because it feels good, but because, deep down, you have chosen to trust God's nature more than your own shifting perceptions. This spiritual pain you feel is not necessarily punishment. It may be a process of deepening, strengthening, transforming. A process of moving from a faith based on constantly feeling God to a faith that knows He is present even when silence fills the space. Maybe God hasn't gone anywhere. Maybe He is teaching you to trust, even when you cannot see Him.